everyone, and welcome. Thank you all so much for joining us today for this live stream event. My name is Alexia, and I am the program manager of the Microsoft Reactor Toronto. I will be sharing session resources with you in the chat, but before we begin, I'd like to quickly review two items: our code of conduct and event guidelines. First, please take a moment to review our code of conduct. Microsoft Reactor seeks to provide a respectful environment for both our audience and presenters. We encourage engagement in the chat, but please be mindful of your commentary, remain professional and on topic. And secondly, our event guidelines. This session is being recorded and will be available on demand through the Microsoft Reactor YouTube channel in about 24 to 48 hours. I'll be sharing the link in the chat for our on-demand content. And if you have not been on a live stream to YouTube before, please note that you must create an account on YouTube in order to have access or interact in the chat. You can set that up now, and if you're unable to use the chat but have questions, feel free to reach out to us through social media or on our website. Which brings us to today's session. I'm going to bring in our speaker here for today, Juan and Brian. Hello, welcome back.
Thank you so much, Alexia. Again, and to all our viewers, I just want to thank you for being here today. We'll have a super interesting topic and a great speaker. Before we go forward, I just want to say that this initiative is part of the Access Innovators Network, and our main goal is to help people understand more about AI, how to utilize it, and even companies who are utilizing it to build their product. What can they do? And in this case, what can they actually expect in terms of the legal side of it? I do want to take the time to thank Alexia and Microsoft Reactor for partnering up with us. And also remember, this week is Accessibility Week. So make sure that you try to think about accessibility when designing or creating your products. With that said, I want to welcome Brian Chau. Brian, thank you so much for being here. And can you tell us a little bit more about yourself?
Sure. Thank you for having us, Juan. So just a bit about myself. My background's electrical engineering, and then I went to law school and I became a patent lawyer. Most of my work is related to IP strategy, and one of my big focus areas is IP as it relates to AI, machine learning innovations. We've filed lots of patent applications and done a lot of work with companies with respect to their copyrights, data sets, all of those kinds of things. Super excited to be here speaking with you today. Accessibility is actually something that's very near and dear to my heart. In my family, we have a number of people who have some vision impairments, including myself. And for me, seeing this kind of technology, this is kind of why we have technology in the first place, to make lives better and to be able to participate fully in society. I used to work on lots of wheelchair innovations, different things for different rollators for people who are infirm and aged, and to me, just seeing the evolution of technology is really beautiful.
Thank you so much, Brian. And to be fully transparent, how we met Brian is because he's helping us in our organization to go through the whole IP and what we need to do. But one of the things I really liked is that from the very beginning, you acknowledge, hey, Juan, I know you have a disability. What are some of the things I can do to make it better? So I appreciate that. And with that said, maybe can you also expand a little bit in terms of how your company helps organizations in terms of IP and maybe other legal items before we get into our conversation?
Great. I'll be relatively quick. So we're a full-service IP firm, essentially a global law firm. But just in terms of the way we work, we typically have essentially two streams of clients. We have our very large enterprise clients like banks, insurance companies, those kinds of companies, and we also have startup companies. And the way we work with companies is that it's more of a holistic strategy-based approach, and we're trying to find solutions that are really kind of fit for purpose based off of essentially your business strategy. And my personal philosophy with IP, at least, is that your business strategy drives your IP strategy as opposed to the other way around. And one of the nice things about the IP landscape in Canada right now is that the government's actually very supportive in terms of IP filings by Canadian companies, especially Ontario-based companies right now. There's lots of different support programs. And Juan and I are actually working with a program called IP Assist, and it's actually being very generously sponsored by the Canadian government, and it's also through Mars Discovery District.
That's right. And I have to say, it has been wonderful. So, if anybody is interested about learning more about the specific program, I invite you to reach out to Brian. He was wonderful in terms of being able to provide information and what we needed to do. Brian, one thing that is super important, and oftentimes I get people asking me why IP is so important or so crucial when you're developing with AI.
So getting it right in the beginning is so important. Essentially, IP. I'm a bit of a realist when it comes to these things. I don't really want to get into the deep academic discussion of whether or not it's the right thing, whether or not it's the wrong thing. For me, it's just make sure that your company is well set up from the beginning to have the right strategic discussions in place and the right mindset. And really thinking about what is even the point of IP, right? So from an IP perspective, it's originally a set of frameworks that were designed to protect two types of innovations. So there's like the fruit of the mind type innovations, and then there's like the sweat of the brow type innovations. And there's a number of different types of IP, but generally speaking, the whole idea is that you're promoting innovation in a specific field by giving people exclusive rights to certain things, and then in exchange, for some of the different types of IP at least, it's giving it to the public eventually as well for some of them, right? And there's this balance, right? So IP rights both give exclusive rights to innovators and essentially people who are working and building stuff. At the same time, by giving them those exclusive rights, it constrains the market, right? So we've all seen issues with overly broad patents being asserted against people, and in a very kind of bullying way. And again, it's important to be mindful of both the opportunities and the risks associated with IP. And some of it is just making sure that from the beginning, you have a good strategy in mind, saying, hey, we're going to do these things, and we're not going to do these things, and here's why. And being able to articulate that, especially to like a board of directors, is really, really, really important. And that kind of guides your overall IP framework. And from a practical perspective for founders, it also controls your budget too. IP spend can get wildly out of control. So part of it is thinking, hey, does this really support a business? And then taking proactive steps to say, we're going to focus on these things and we're going to focus less on these other things as well.
Yeah, I agree. Again, one of the things I like that you guide us through is that specific framework. And I think frameworks are very, very important, especially when you don't know much about the topic. With that said, can you talk about some of the biggest misconceptions founders or some of your clients have when it comes to IP protection?
So I think the biggest one, this is more AI machine learning focused right now, is that there are some aspects when people are thinking, hey, it's a free and open marketplace. I can do whatever I want. We've guided a few of our clients all the way to the exit stage, and mistakes when it comes to IP policies and IP approaches can be really painful for your future valuation. So when the acquirer was buying our client's company, they were like, hey, asking all these questions about the IP, and it's really important to have answers for all of those things. One of the biggest misconceptions first is that you're free and clear to kind of do whatever you want with, training sets, architectures, all of those kinds of things. And if there are IP rights, it can get really messy really fast. There's a few examples. There's actually one really difficult one where a company had essentially created a data set of different house layouts, and it was I think it was a Lithuanian company, and they had essentially used this as a great way to kind of have their own data set in their back end. A set of researchers in Princeton had essentially wrote a crawler to get all this stuff from their website, and then that was used to create a machine learning data set that was used for benchmarking. It was used for hackathon by a very large social media company. And now the question is who owns what, and it's super messy. It's in litigation right now. So these are kind of situations where people thought they were free and clear to use it because it was a data set from a published paper from Princeton. But at the same time, it really wasn't clear where the rights are from, and now it's in litigation, and the data set's been pulled, and it's very, very, very messy. So that's one aspect. And then the second aspect is that people think software isn't patentable. It totally is, so just watch out for that. And then the final one is that in the past, the AI machine learning space was a bit of a very nice space, but Unfortunately, the IP disputes are starting to pick up, and there's going to be a lot more activity from very opportunistic market participants. Rightfully or wrongfully, I'm not here to judge, but similar to certain other industries, the moment you start a startup and you're starting to get a bit of success and traction, that's when the lawsuits start showing up from what we call them non-practicing entities, but the other term for them is like patent trolls, copyright trolls, trademark trolls, right? And as a founder, it's important to recognize that unfortunately this is the cost of doing business, and these are the options to fight these things. And then similarly, taking the right steps to make sure you have the right defensive portfolio in the event that you need to fight back.
Yeah, so I think that's really important. I think a lot of times founders don't realize if you're going to be creating a specific type of technology utilizing AI or data sets, you need to understand how is that you're going to be using them if you're going to be using open source. Because at the end of the day, one of them is going to be the IP filing that you have to do, but also if you're going to be talking to investors, that's the first thing that they're going to be looking at. So maybe can you share some of the one or two tips that people need to start thinking of when trying to create technology, especially if they are going to be utilizing any kind of open source tools or
Yeah.
frameworks?
So for each of the different types of IP, you should make sure you have a strategy for that, first of
Mhm.
all, and then start building an inventory, start building policies in place. And a lot of it's easy when you do it in the early stages and hard when you're doing it later. I can quickly share my screen. I can
Sure.
show I can just show a few tools that I've put together. So these are tools that we've put together for essentially IP Ontario. So there's actually going to be an IP Ontario toolkit eventually, which is going to be free and publicly available. But if anyone wants this slide, I can always show them. But long story short is that we've put together, and if anyone's got any accessibility challenges, let me know. I can try to zoom in on different parts or just explain it. But generally speaking, for different types of IP, here are generally the 5 buckets of IP, and just some commentary about it. You can take a look at it in your own time, but making sure you have a strategy for that is really, really important. And then also starting to build an inventory. And then, to Juan's point just now, if you're going to be using third-party IP, for example, do a super good job of keeping records of, where you got the licenses from, what can you do with the license, what can't you do with the license, where are you taking risks, all of those kinds of things. And then especially with open source, there are some very specific challenges with open source, and the specific challenges are you have to make sure you follow the specific requirements set out by the contributors in the license, and it's not always super clear. So part of it is just making sure that you're not too much of a cowboy with using open source, and make sure it gets approved and the proper channels are gone through in terms of, even if it's a quick legal review saying, hey, MIT license is cool, but we don't use GPL licenses, something like that, right? And just making sure that you have that thought out. And then secondly, also being really mindful of some of the, it's not really IP related, but some of the risks associated with other aspects of using third-party code, such as like IT security risks, like Heartbleed, and you've got other types of IT security things that could happen because you've got a vulnerability that you inherited from the third-party code. And I put just in these slides, I put just kind of basic thoughts, but this is just a way for people to conceptualize, what are the types of legal costs, what are the types of considerations, all of those kinds of things for each of the different types of IP. And then finally, one of the things that I really think is really useful is that companies and founders should really think about IP on a shoestring in the really early days, and just take the absolute most basic steps to protect their IP. And some of these things, it's best with a lawyer, best with a patent agent, trademark agent, whatnot, professional, but not absolutely necessary. And the various IP offices do actually have tools to support founders in doing some of their own filings. So, for example, I work for an electric vehicle company, and they love to file their own provisional applications, for example, and then give them to me a few months later and say, hey, can you help me formalize this technology? And it's a way for them to keep costs down, and there's all sorts of different ways of keeping costs down, and it's really important to understand those mechanisms. I think that's it for the slides.
Very cool. I have a question on this. So right now we're talking about this specific tool going to the provincial, meaning Ontario. But what if you're going to be trying to work all over Canada. Can this be transferable? And if we look not only in Canada but beyond, let's say going to the States or any other jurisdiction, can we also utilize this same tool?
Yeah, so IP rights are generally harmonized across the world and across different jurisdictions. Generally speaking, for our clients, the big markets are US, Canada, Europe, and China. And there's different mechanisms to essentially nationalize your rights in different countries. IP rights are a national right for each country, so you do need separate applications for each country. So let's say you have a patent application in the US and you get a granted US patent, you can use it to prevent making, using, selling, and potentially import export only in the US, right? If you have a Canadian passport, similar types of mechanisms. So, but the biggest challenge is that your costs like scale up immensely and very, very, very quickly depending on the number of countries. So oftentimes, even for really big like medical device companies that I work for and other types of AI companies, we often only file in a handful of countries where we know these are the main markets. And the reality is, if we launch a lawsuit, we'll probably launch a lawsuit in the US or Europe.
Oh, that's interesting. Sorry, Brian, before we keep going, may I ask you to please stop sharing your screen?
Yep.
Awesome. That's fascinating. One thing that we've talked about is IP, different jurisdiction, and what if you're going to be using open source products? But what if you're actually utilizing AI to create your software? Right now, people are using tools such as Cursor. They might be using v0.dev. They may be using even ChatGPT or Claude to help them develop. Is great because they're going to they're going to provide a big exponential increase in terms of your productivity, but at the same time you're going to be utilizing a lot of AI to create your own tool. What about in that specific case when you're relying a lot in AI to create your code? Is there something we need to be able to watch out or pay attention for?
Sure. So I'm going to talk about it from two different perspectives. So the first perspective is risk of being sued, right? And when you're using various AI tools, even some of the latest ones, you have to be very careful. There are some interesting discussions around, whether or not certain types of training using copyrighted material, even from very popular tools, whether or not they've been trained with copyrighted materials that they didn't have the rights to use for training, and whether or not that's even infringement. So a lot of the more recent tools, they've put in indemnification clauses in there saying that they will step in and defend you from a lawsuit in certain situations. Make sure that the way you use the tools, the parameters you set, and the way you do your prompts and all of those kinds of things, follow whatever things just to make sure that you have the benefit of those indemnifications in case you do get sued. And example situations, let's say, you ask it to write a book and it takes, a Song of Fire and Ice from George R.R. Martin, and, it looks exactly the same word for word, right? You can have a major problem there, right? And these are the types of things that are going through litigation right now. So indemnifications are super useful. Make sure you can avail yourself of them. So that's on the risk side. Now, on the opportunity side, protecting your IP, this is a very messy area right now. In terms of protection, so I'll use copyright in this example. U.S. Copyright Office gave out some really useful guidance recently, saying that particular things, if it's like, let's say it's all prompt and it's, there's not too much creativity on the author side, it's probably not going to get copyright. The example they had there was like some storyboard like statements that were used as prompts. The storyboard itself, like the script, could be copyrighted, but they didn't give copyright protection to the images that it was created for this particular comic strip, even though the person had put in some level of work into curating which ones went to it and so on and so forth. Now, on the other hand, they gave an example of this like lady with cyborg flowers, right? And essentially for that one, it was interesting. So someone had drawn a hand sketch by hand, and then they put it through, I think it was one of the generative AI artwork programs, and then that added texture to it. It added like different types of elements to it, flowers, all sorts of stuff. But the underlying cyborg lady drawing was from this author, and the Copyright Office said that, hey, this is an example of AI supporting human ingenuity, and this should be something that's copyrightable, even though AI was used in this generation. So right now, the question of how much contribution from a human inventor author is required is still a bit of an open question. But generally speaking, really do a good job, just from a practical perspective, do a good job keeping track of your actual workflow and how you created it. At the end of the day, all of these fights are going to be about evidence and how good your evidence is. So if you can show evidence that, hey, I drew the original drawing and then I uploaded that and then I used AI to tweak it or make it better or add textures or, I love that there's a really cool Adobe keynote recently where a kid drew a dragon and a knight, and they had it animate a fight scene between a dragon and the knight just from 2D drawings in 3D. So that was really cool. But like that's an example where the human had drawn the original things and then used the tools as a way to kind of like as a force multiplier for their creativity, right? So keeping track of that's really important.
That's actually, well, he actually went through a few things. We talk about prompts, content created by prompts, as well as copyright. So I want to take those ones each separately, but I want to go back in terms of the prompt and the content.
Yeah.
I want to separate both of them. So let's say I'm going to be utilizing specific type of prompts. There is a science when it comes to creating prompts. That's why there are such a thing as prompt engineering. The specific prompt you're going to create for your AI system or product to work, can those be copyright?
Maybe the prompt itself, the actual like words you use, let's say they use human ingenuity, the prompt, the output that you use after using the prompt and using it as using it through the engine may not, that's going to be harder to copyright. So let's say that let's say that I want some desired functionality X, right? And then I put it into the prompt and I wanted to create, a Visual Basic code for it, for example, right? And the output code, it might not be protectable. So the other aspect to think about at that situation is to do a really good job with trade secrets as your backup position. So typically speaking, when there's an IP lawsuit, they just take every possible form of IP and throw it at the opponent. So they're going to hit them with a trademark lawsuit, a copyright lawsuit, a trade secret lawsuit, and so on and so forth. And trade secret's another really good mechanism. And typically speaking, from a trade secret perspective or confidential information, that's kind of similar but not exactly the same. There's very heavy overlap. Long story short is that someone has misappropriated your confidential information and they've used it in a way to advantage themselves, right? So let's say that you have code that is probably on the borderline, right, of whether or not it's actually protectable by copyright. If you show that you kept it secret for your company and then someone, some bad guy went in there and breached your server and stole this code and then used it, you would be able to essentially go after them on a second ground of IP infringement. And essentially you would want to use both. Not sure which one would stick.
I see. And when it comes to protection, so let's say I just find this fascinating, and I again see a clear differentiation between the content and maybe the output from it. But let's jump in terms of like me coding an application. So once I'm going to be giving the specific prompt to the AI, and it's going to start producing or creating the code for me, depending on the prompt I give it. So for instance, I'm just going to give an example. I want you to create a drop-down menu and it's going to have X type of characteristics, right? So it's going to start developing that for me. Now, I don't know if somebody's going to come later on and say, oh, you know what, you utilize our own specific methodology or code to create your own, although I'm using AI. But is it possible for me to instruct the AI to say, hey, as you're creating the specific component, I want you to do A, B, C, and D, and at the same time document all of that. So it is going to be an accelerator in terms of the AI creating the application. However, it's going to be created in such a way that is based on my own specific architectural decision or input. That way, the likelihood of it being the same as another application is going to be different. Will that work? In that case, me utilizing a tool to accelerate the development, however, keeping track of how that's going to be done?
Yeah, the more you can show your contribution, like the reality is from a machine learning perspective, we're not really sure what's going on from the latent space perspective, right? So, it's essentially generating the tokens for the output, right? But what distribution is it learning from? What distribution is it drawing from, right? Did it memorize the underlying code for someone else's code and is spitting it out verbatim? Or is it actually creating something from the overall, like let's say it creates like if you think about a high dimensionality perspective, like a high dimensionality distribution from a million training examples, right? And it learns a probability distribution and so on and so forth, and it starts spitting things out. And each thing is this transformed aspect from the million training elements, right? As opposed to taking one training element and just memorizing and spitting it back out. And we don't know what the output is, and that's the biggest problem with machine learning, and that's why the risk is always there. So the more you can show that is from your contribution and you gave it specific instructions to do a particular thing, or it's just something that's really generic, like a helper function, create me a drop-down radio button dialog with these specific types of input validation or something like that, right? And although it's probably drawing code from somewhere, it's generic enough. One, you can swap it out if someone complains about it, and two, it's not so unique to a particular training element from the training set, where you can still make a strong argument that it's probably got 5,000 examples of, let's say it's MVC architecture for UI stuff, right? So model view controller type stuff. It's pretty straightforward, like mechanism for serving web pages, right? There's so many examples of it out there. It's probably not just going to draw from one and spit it for you exactly. On the other hand, this is not really a code example, but it's a comics example now. I want you to make comics in the style of XKCD, right? And essentially, it's got a very small set of useful training elements for that. Stick figure drawings, and it's gonna essentially, the chance of it actually just copying the XKCD comic is very high at that point, right? And you have to be very, very careful. So that's a situation where you're kind of walking into a bit of a landmine there. On the other hand, if it's for relatively generic stuff, or you've given it very specific instructions that are kind of fruits of your own mind and labor, the chances of it creating an output that's essentially someone's going to complain about is a lot less, and it's much safer. So when our clients, we have a lot of bank clients, we create guidelines for them saying, hey, these are types of acceptable use cases for using AI, machine learning, and using these kind of tools, but for their employees, just tell them to be careful about these things and keep track of your prompts and that kind of stuff, just in case someone complains. At least they can investigate and say, hey, there's merit to this, or there's no merit to this complaint. Because at the end of the day, one of the biggest problems for people who are also on the complaining side, when they want to issue a complaint against a company for possible infringement, they also have no idea what you do. And let's say that they sue you, oftentimes they use something called a discovery process to learn about what you do so they can actually substantiate their claim. So if your evidence is bad, you kept bad records, it's just frustrating to both sides, because they're like, hey, what did you use to train this thing to create your output? I want to see if you actually are infringing on my copyrights. And you're like, I don't know, right? So that's really bad, because then it becomes really frustrating for both sides.
Very interesting. Now, let's go back to the patterns and copyrights. Can you expand a little bit more on those ones, and what are some of the things that companies or individuals that are creating any kind of software or utilizing AI they need to think of?
Sure. So on the patent side, so patents are around inventions, and specifically, this is how I think of it, at least, is you have a technical problem and you come up with innovative technical solution. Now, patents are really powerful in that they can stop even independent creation. So to give you an example would be, let's say that I came up with a very efficient architecture for processing word tokens, for example, and it's the specific combinations of RNNs and CNNs and LSTMs or whatever, right? And it solves a problem relating to, I don't know, catastrophic forgetting or something like that, right? And it's this very specific architecture I put together, right? And I got a patent over that, even though somebody independently created it without copying me at all, and they use the same architecture for my claims, I can sue them and I can get rights, essentially get some sort of damage award over them, right? So that's the great value of patents. Now, on the other hand, patents have to be new, innovative, and useful, essentially. And from an innovation perspective, it needs to have essentially inventive step. over what's out there. So let's say that you're using, StyleGAN, and you just tweaked it a little bit. You're probably not going to get a patent on that, because the examiner is just going to say, hey, StyleGAN's already out there. You're just using it in a specific, environment or use case. No patent, right? So that's the patent side. Copyright, on the other hand, is more around things that like an author creates, right? And it was originally designed to protect things like artwork and those kinds of things. But it requires two things. It requires actual access and actually copying. So copyright doesn't apply against independent creators typically. And that's really important. So essentially someone has to see your code, copy your code, and use it, or drawing, or even transform it a certain way. But that's the copyright side of things. Now, from an AI perspective, copyrights are really important in respect of the output. So copyright can be used for artwork, generated code, all of those kinds of things, or even code you write yourself. And software code is a bit awkward from a copyright perspective, because it was never really well designed for it. But nonetheless, it's used practically for protecting code. So, like let's say you sell proprietary software, one of your engineers copies your code base and brings it to, competitor XYZ, right? Then you can sue them for copyright infringement and possibly a trade secret / confidential information misappropriation. And then the other things for copyright that's really important is some things aren't patentable, they're still copyrightable, right? So let's say you've got machine learning weights, you've got different ways of your underlying documentation, or one of the biggest things right now, it's a huge battleground, is data sets. So let's say that you have a big pile of SE data, right? And you paid a whole bunch of your interns to manually gold label every single element, right? So there's an airplane at coordinate XY, right? The bounding box, right? This is a blue airplane, this is a red airplane, right? And so on and so forth. And you took this really dirty image data set, and then you've added all these labels to it, right? And let's say that somebody steals your data set plus those labels, right? You could possibly say that, hey, there's infringement, not just of the underlying pictures of airplanes, but also of the labeling effort that we put into it as well.
That is very interesting, because I got actually my next question was going to be, a lot of companies are trying to do many things with AI, but the reality is that you're going to have the bigger companies, whether it's going to be a Meta, Microsoft, OpenAI, where they actually have their models and they have trained them. A lot of companies, startups, what they're going to be doing is utilizing those models. For instance, they may utilize Azure OpenAI from Microsoft and build on top of the whole infrastructure they have created, utilizing the OpenAI model and then communicating with that. But to that specific one, they're going to enhance the ability of the AI, perhaps utilizing the data as you created, as you mentioned, or they're going to be creating specific frameworks and technology that is going to interact with that one. At that specific point, what are some of the things that companies need to look for or watch out when it comes to, okay, we are developing with AI, we don't have a specific model because we're utilizing another technology to build on top of it. But in that case, what are some of the IP trademarks or patents that they need to be looking for?
It's really messy right now. There's a whole bunch of litigation going on, so I have to be very careful in terms of what I say about it generally right now. But long story short is that the field is really heating up. I'm really curious to see what the courts are going to say. So a lot of this is actually active litigation right now. A number of newspapers and I think magazines had actually sued some of the big AI companies. And then there's also AI company versus AI company litigation right now. So unfortunately, there's really, really, really poor and kind of fuzzy guidance right now. And then when the court decisions they come out, sometimes they're also inconsistent or they get appealed. So it's unfortunately for founders, it's a very, very, very gray zone right now. I would say, use at your own risk, but you have to be mindful of the fact that, with every decision that comes out, every new guidance that comes out, the landscape may change entirely for you. And so, for example, when a lot of our clients were thinking about potentially using fair use defenses in the US, the Canadian equivalent is fair dealing. It's a really kind of, my opinion, is frustrating to use because essentially you have to convince a court that even though you infringed on someone else's copyright, it was fair to do so. So, like let's say that, it's not particularly creative, or, you did use it in a non-commercial sense, or it's a very small part of your thing, all of those kinds of things, potential factors, right? And then there was a recent copyright guidance that came out a few days ago. It's actually still in preprint stage from the U.S. Copyright Office on generative AI. But long story short is that it actually shows the office's position on certain fair use defenses. And a lot of the fair use defenses that people were thinking, oh, this might be useful, like saying that it's a transformative use, right? And it should be allowable, right? The Copyright Office position is that's not going to be a good ground for fair use, right? So the moment that came out, it's the risk level for using AI tools just went straight up, right? And we'll see how it goes in court. It's one of the areas that's just so messy right now that it's really hard to say that unfortunately, there's no really good definitive advice. But I would say at the same time, like when we talk to our clients, we're like, hey, if we want to take the belt and suspenders approach as lawyers, right, then you should never use AI. You should never use machine learning tools, right? But that's not the reality, right? There's such important tools and such good tools that companies just need to be able to manage their risk and just have a game plan for how to deal with complaints if and when they arise. And one of the things I've learned in the patent space is that there may be lots of meritless complaints, especially in the US. There are companies that are designed to threaten and bully, especially startup companies. And unfortunately, because it costs so much to defend against a lawsuit, and or it costs so much to even have lawyers investigate it, these meritless companies are able to still extract and essentially extort startups. So just something to be very mindful of.
Oh, wow. So in that case, what are some of the things and startups need to do or start thinking of in case such thing happens? So is there a specific? I know you mentioned about documenting and everything like that, but is there anything else they need to do if they're confronted with such specific situation where they can say, okay, you know what? At least we're going to be able to try to defend ourselves.
I think the first thing is to have a game plan, because it's going to happen, especially if you operate in the US. Like, for example, even like clothing design patterns, right? There's a troll that goes out there and sues everybody that has like heart shapes on clothing, for example, right? Like it's insane how much litigation there is in the US and how these opportunistic parties operate. So have a game plan. They typically send a really nasty letter, like govern yourself accordingly, and they send it to the CEO, and they send it to general counsel, and then causes a big thing, right? But then when you realize that a lot of these are just kind of meritless, and this is our game plan for responding. That's the first aspect of it. And then the other aspect is to think about what are the tools you have at your disposal, not just your own IP filings, but things like there's various types of IP insurance programs that are really helpful. If you're a clean tech startup in Canada, for example, there's something called the Innovation Asset Collective, and it's a really, really, really cool kind of program framework, and all of their members, their full members, get access to essentially IP insurance products that they've signed up with an underwriter for. And in these kind of situations, somebody sues you, questionable merit, right? But the insurance company actually steps in and defends on your behalf, right? And they bring in their own set of expertise litigators, and essentially, from a business owner perspective, it gets the problem off your back and onto someone else's plate, right?
Wow.
And that's the most important part, because I'm actually dealing with 3 lawsuits right now, and just the mental energy and fatigue I see from the founder. I can see him being worn down by these lawsuits. These third parties are ultra aggressive, and they're essentially bloodhounds, right? And their tactics are very, very mean spirited, right? They'll send letters to Amazon, they'll send letters to your customers, right? And they'll even make very kind of nasty remarks about you in the press, right? And they do all of these things to wear you down and essentially ask for 20, 30, $100,000, right? And if you keep paying all of them, what ends up happening is that they end up draining you like vampires. They essentially just all start draining cash flow, right? So it's important to actually take a stand on some of these as well.
I agree with you. We see it, especially in accessibility, in the States, especially as you said, very litigious. But what we see is a lot of companies get sued because a specific website is not accessible. They claim The accessibility is not done properly, and what they do is they provide a report, and it's not really indicative of anything, to be honest with you. And a lot of times people settle or companies settle, but the next month you have the same kind of like lawsuit from another type of lawyer, and then they just keep going and going. Okay, so we have a lot of organizations, or we know of a lot of organizations that are trying to utilize AI, but for social good. That specific point, they may be creating um, their own data sets, or maybe using some open source type of tools, right? They may want to commercialize it, but maybe not in such a way that they want to receive profit from it, but it's just going to be in a non-for-profit type of area. So in that specific example, what are some of the things that they need to worry about in terms of IP protection, or maybe not getting sued as a result of them utilizing some of these tools?
Yeah, so I actually do a bit of advice for the Ontario government over
Mhm.
healthcare data. And one of the things to think about is first, obviously, make sure you protect your IP rights, and then you can choose what to do with them at that point, right? And if you want to be like a nice citizen to the world, or you want to contribute a certain way, and a lot of even our enterprise clients, they actually contribute to open source projects as a
Mhm.
way of giving back to the community as part of their overall philosophy. Like they're not just big, profit making organizations. They actually, like they let's say they use like a particular thing from like Apache Spark or something like that, right? They'll actually contribute code back in and have the right policies in place, and they actually thought about it really well. Long story short, I would say that the key things to think about first are think about from a strategic perspective what you want people to be able to do in the future with your product, and then picking the right open source license for that if you want to open source something. So generally speaking, the bifurcation points are if you want people to freely use it, even without attribution to you or with basic attributions, but they can kind of do whatever they want to it at some risk of someone even just copying what you have, you can release it on like an MIT license, very, very free permissive license. All it has is a disclaimer saying, if it doesn't work or there's an issue, you can't sue me, right? And that's a standard kind of disclaimer, so it's just basic protections. But the problem with releasing something on their MIT license is, let's say that you released a really great, let's say it's like an optical magnifier, for example, right? And you're like, oh great, everyone can use this code, right? And then you see someone else just essentially forking your project and calling it something confusingly similar, and then say, hey, charge $1.99 on the App Store. And a few of our clients who were very good natured originally when they were releasing their apps had this problem, right? They released on a very permissive license, and then immediately somebody opportunistically forked their code and then created a similar kind of profile on the App Store, but sold it for $1.99 instead of free, which is what they originally thought, right? And that's always a risk. And then you can also put very restrictive licenses on it as well, saying that, hey, if anyone's familiar with XKCD and the Richard Stallman and all of that kind of stuff, essentially he created something called a copyleft type of agreement, and that kind of open source that you see with GPL, LGPL, AGPL, and so on and so forth. These kind of licenses have a very interesting trigger in that I'm giving it to you, to the world for free, and I'm giving the source code, but in return, every derivative that you make or every modification, or even if you incorporate other stuff depending on the license, you have to give up for free under the same license terms as well. So that's another philosophy of looking at it. The problem with releasing code like that is that it limits your potential base of users, because a lot of corporate companies will not allow that kind of code to incorporate in their code base because it imparts these obligations they don't want.
Yeah.
So an example of this would be, let me think of something like VLC Viewer, for example, right? If you want to incorporate VLC Viewer, oftentimes under GPL, and then, essentially it would make all your entire code base to be released as well. Linux kernel is another good example. And you'll see this with companies where, they took it and they used it, and then they got a threatening letter from whatever software foundation saying they have to open source all of their stuff too. For better or for worse, these are different philosophical debates that you should have internally before you choose which license to use.
Wow, interesting. Now, on the other side, if you're a small organization, a small startup, oftentimes you want to collaborate with other ones. You're going to be able to share resources and maybe get to a specific product faster or service. what are some of the things that our organization in that specific type of situation needs to look for or in protect whenever they're working with other service providers or startups?
Just be clear in terms of what the expectations are, who owns what IP, who can do what with what, and who owns essentially the fruits of whatever comes out. We've unwound and we've also had to kind of untangle parties where it just wasn't clear. So usually what I recommend, just from a practical perspective, is just essentially a CEO to CEO having a term sheet set up over the major terms, who owns what, who owns, like if we develop this together, like, do I own the app? Do you own the app? Who's filing the patent application? Who's paying for the costs, and so on and so forth? And just kind of hashing that out, and then bring it to the lawyers at that point, as opposed to having the lawyers negotiate, because the lawyers will end up fighting over really small and kind of inconsequential stuff all the time and wasting a ton of money. But making sure that's really clear in the agreements and in the term sheets is really important. And then the second aspect I also think is really, really just useful from an IP perspective is that, thinking about what is the overall product and kind of where the line is drawn between who owns what. So I usually just have an architecture diagram or flowchart diagram. I just stick a big line through it, and I say, this side is owned by this scale up from the university, and this side is owned by a large car manufacturer, right at the end, right? And just making sure that that's clear to both parties before the actual collaboration starts, because like when something becomes successful, that's when the fighting begins, right? And if you can avoid all of this fighting by actually clearly meeting the minds before you spend a huge amount of money on the collaboration.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Really appreciate the time you coming here and providing some of the information. Right now, maybe I want to open questions for our audience. Maybe Alexia, if you can help us with that. Maybe do we have any questions so far?
Yes, absolutely. The first question we have is, looking ahead, what's the biggest reason for company to keep investing in protecting their ideas and brand when the world seems to be sharing more and more information freely?
So I'm of the opposite view. I think the world was sharing stuff very freely, and I think it's heating up and getting nasty. One of the things that I love about the U.S. and I also hate about the U.S. is that the inventive and pioneering spirit of the U.S. is very heavily captured in the IP system, and you start seeing companies originally having kind of very noble intents, and then once the dollar signs start showing up, and once things are getting very successful, lawsuits start showing up everywhere, and then very opportunistic companies, to Juan's point earlier about even disability and accessibility, like regulations and rules around websites and all of those kinds of things. Originally, they were meant to be essentially promoting websites to be accessible to everybody, right? Like all text for images and so on and so forth, right? Sufficiently large fonts. And now it's being weaponized by certain lawyers to essentially be able to create this cottage industry of a money-making machine, for lack of a better word, right? So I would say that companies should be proactive and take steps to protect their ideas, at the same time not blowing the budget on it either. As an IP lawyer, obviously I benefit from people filing tons of protection, but I don't think it's the right answer for every company. I think what's important is finding something that's fit for your business and making the right cost decisions to say, hey, we won't do a certain thing.
Okay.
All right, thank you for this. The next question is, why is it still important to have IP rules to keep new ideas and creation coming?
I don't know, to be honest with you. I'm the kind of person who's optimists yell at the wind, pessimists blame the wind, and realists just adjust the sails. So in my view, it's above my pay grade to think about whether or not we should have IP rules. The reality is it was designed way back in the day, in kind of the 1600s, of we want to protect the fruits of people's minds and labor and all of those kinds of things. On the one hand, it's let's say you're an investor, right? And this company doesn't have any exclusive rights to the particular technology that they've spent 10 million, like drugs, for example, like pharmaceuticals is a really good example, right? They spend $1 billion on various types of testing that they have to do, and if they have no way of protecting it, a generic just comes and eats the market and sells it at marginal price for manufacturing plus some sort of margin, right? And then they can't recoup any of those investment costs. So why would anyone invest $1 billion in looking for a new product, right? So that's a situation where it's pretty clear there should be IP rights. On the other hand, with AI, machine learning models, there is a very, very substantiated argument that, hey, maybe the IP system doesn't work that well for computer science inventions. I don't think they're totally wrong, but unfortunately, I'm not the policy setter, so we just live with what we have.
Thank you.
Yeah, sorry for that.
Next one is, what are some practical steps small teams can take to keep critical parts of their AI projects confidential and protected as trade secrets, especially when collaborating remotely or using shared tools?
Oh yeah, this is a pretty straightforward common sense type mechanism. So typically with trade secrets, there's a few different statutes and lots of case law out there, but my view at least, generally speaking with trade secrets is, does the party who's getting access to it know it's trade secret? Do they know it's valuable? So, make sure you do common sense things like stick that it's proprietary, it's confidential, it's authored by whomever, it's owned by whomever, and make sure that shows up in, your source code, in README files, right, in various splash pages, all that kind of stuff, right, and also the documents themselves, and then take reasonable steps to protect certain things. When the court looks at these things, they actually look at it kind of holistically, and they say, hey, for the super valuable, like the example often ones is like pricing algorithms for like online trading and all of that kind of stuff, right, and pricing assets, right. And did they take the right steps and reasonable steps to protect it? And in a situation where there's a lawsuit, it means the steps failed, right? That always happens where whatever protection steps you had in that they were using failed. So like, let's say they had a passive protection, they used a specific cloud server, right? And let's say it's below industry standard, right? So the infringer would say, hey, we may have stolen your IP, but you did such a bad job protecting it that you're not deserving of rights, right? And that's actually a substantiated argument sometimes. So part of it is just make sure you take common sense approaches to it. And if something's super valuable, so I'll give you an example, WD-40 is something that could be patented, but they chose not to patent it on purpose. And they kept it as trade secret because they wanted protection more than 20 years. But WD-40 is insanely rigorous about how they protect it, to the point where I don't even think anyone actually even knows the recipe anymore, right? And it's like it's been sharded. It's they keep it in vaults. They keep the same thing with Coca-Cola, right? And they go to such lengths. And like Coca-Cola is a really good example. If you're a bottling company, you get these weird bags that just label merchandise with a number on it, and then you just mix them according to some instructions. But no one has any clue what's even in those bags, right? And even though it's a worldwide product, it's actually really hard to figure out how they make Coca-Cola. And they've done these things on purpose. And if there's a leak of it, they can show that they went through some really insane levels of protection. But it's justified because it's worth so much, right?
Okay.
So like machine learning weights and training is a really big thing to protect. So make sure you protect that.
Awesome.
Thank you so much. Yeah. And last question is, with so many open source AI tools and data set being used in development today, how can we responsibly navigate IP risk while still benefiting from the collaborative nature of open source communities?
Yeah, so I really love this. I do a lot of stuff with health data, and and also geological data. And one of the things I love the most is that the governments have been amazing at releasing a lot of really high quality data sets for health data, geological surveys. You get like NASA data and so on and so forth. generally speaking, do a responsible job of keeping track of what licenses they come under, what restrictions they have. But I would say that you can generally benefit from the collaborative nature of those kinds of things. It's pretty straightforward to do so. Just make sure that from a risk management perspective, you always know that there is some level of underlying risk that you can't contract out of. So just be mindful of that. Let's say like ImageNet, for example. There's a bunch of questionable images in there. There's a whole bunch of mislabeled stuff in there, all sorts of stuff like that, right? And some of the stuff is questionable, right? On the other hand, you have like a NASA data set, which is super clean, right? Probably no problems there, right? And then the other thing to think about is so use your common sense and ask yourself, from an open source perspective, some of these data sets, are they actually that clean? And they look at how they got it and stuff like that. The example I have for you is data sets that are generated using the Common Crawl, and like C4 and Leon 5B and a few others, where they purport to be these open source data sets. Like Leon 5B is a data set of 5 billion images. But if anyone's kind of had a few minutes, you can go to a website called, I think, haveibeentrained.com, and you can actually see what's in there. And there's a lot of allegations saying that even though it's a quote unquote open source data set, there's a lot of copyrighted work in there, especially webcomics. So that's an example where it's quote unquote open source, but I wouldn't trust it as far as I could throw it. So if you use it, just make sure that you're aware of that risk. And if someone makes a complaint, you can swap out something immediately, because it may not be that worth it. And then the other thing to watch out for is also book data sets. There's another one that's very dangerous right now. Lots of lawsuits about open source book data sets where there's actually a lot of copyrighted material, unfortunately, in there.
Awesome. Brian, thank you so much. I think I learned so much from it. I invite everybody to please reach out. If anybody wants to talk to you or understand a little bit more about the topic, where can they contact you or how can they reach out to you?
They can just find my LinkedIn, or my public profile. Actually, a lot of the tools we made them for a Canadian organization called IP Ontario, and we're actually going to be publishing a lot of this stuff essentially free of charge. Some of the tools might be soft gate kept, essentially just put in your email and the tool gets sent to you. So that'll be getting published. Probably we're actually just cleaning it up and getting it ready to go live soon. But a lot of it's just going to be publicly available. And our whole idea is that you don't necessarily need to hire us to do certain things. Like essentially, like let's say that you need like really careful work, you would bring it to us, but quite expensive. We want to empower people to be able to do a lot of things on their own. You don't need a brain surgeon for everything. Sometimes a nurse practitioner is much more appropriate for the job, right? So that with that mindset, we actually created these tools so that we could essentially rise the level of everybody, without necessarily engaging us formally and stuff.
Awesome. Love that. Thank you so much. Alexia, as always, thank you so much. And everybody, I'll invite you to follow us on LinkedIn, Access Innovators Network. We have a newsletter. We try to make it weekly, sometimes it goes monthly, but please sign up, and soon enough, we're going to be promoting our next event for June. Thank you.
Thank you so much.